Hello and welcome to another video. My name is Heather and as always I'm reading with a vengeance and I hope you are too. So finally, I'm here to talk to you about the books that I read for the semifinals of the Booktube Prize. I did 2 rounds of the Booktube Prize this year. I'm still on the fence on whether or not I'm going to be a judge next year. Really, I kind of know myself. I think I can say now that, oh, probably not, but then it'll come around next year and I'll be like, yeah, I want to do it again. I read 6 books for the octafinals and I had a great time. I think I really loved 4 of the books and then I struggled with 2, if memory serves. This time around, I really loved 2. I struggled with 2, and then there were 2 that I liked okay. So I really wanted to vlog my reviews of each of these books, and I did that for exactly 2 of them. 3 of the books I reviewed right here in my house, and then the one book I had already read, which was Trespasses, and so I just decided to cut my review from my wrap-up and just add it to this video. I also want to say with my portion of the video where I talk about Trespasses, at the time I was still using star ratings for my reviews and I don't do that anymore. So I wanted to cut that portion off for this video. So my review of Trespasses will end rather abruptly, but I want to say right now that Trespasses has stayed with me since I read it, since I reviewed it the first time around, despite my rather lackluster review of it in this video. Also, at this point of recording this intro, I know that the results of the semifinals have already been released. But I had already made the decision on how I ranked these books, and I submitted those rankings probably 2 days before the results came out. But I just wanted to put it out there that my rankings stand. So without further ado, here are my reviews of the books that I read for the semifinals of the Booktube Prize. Next book I read is Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. I'd been looking forward to this book when I saw that it was on the list for the Booktube Prize, but of course I picked it up as it is longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. This is set in Northern Ireland during what's known as the Troubles, and this is the conflict with Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. Some say it was kind of a conflict between Protestants and Catholic, but I think religion is collateral damage to the actual conflict of what was more of a ethno-nationalist conflict. And that's just very surface level. It was a conflict that lasted about 30 years, starting in the early 60s. And I believe this particular story takes place, I want to say in the mid-70s, so right in the thick of it. You're following Cushla. She's about 23 years old, lives in Belfast. She's a single young woman living with her mother, who is an alcoholic, and she works at her family-owned bar with her brother. Cushla and her family are Catholic. One day she meets Michael, who has kind of made a name for himself as a barrister defending members of the IRA. He is not only Protestant, but he's also married. They strike up a relationship and engage in an affair. Cushla, who also works as a teacher, one of her students' father is savagely beaten one day, and it has to do with the Troubles, and it sets off kind of a chain of events. And the story goes from there. I've heard a lot of people kind of put off by this story because the bulk of the first half is basically following Kushla's affair with Michael, and it talks a lot about their relationship. And a lot of people are kind of put off by the adultery, and I get that. I don't have a problem reading about that. Not that I condone it or anything like that. It's just not, to me, it's just kind of a fact of life, sadly. It doesn't make a character unlikable as a whole for me. You know, good people making bad decisions. What I found disappointing was I was expecting more about the Troubles, more about the conflict. And this was more about how that conflict affected people on a much more micro level, which is not bad. This was just a very slow moving story, but really the Troubles were like in the background of this affair between Michael and Cushla. The other problem I had, and this was more of a me thing, is I had a hard time following which characters were on which side of the conflict, other than Cushla and Michael. But going back to Cushla, adultery doesn't make me not like a character outright. And I don't think you're meant to empathize with Kushla, but she's not unlikable. She's a teacher. She loves her students. She actually has this friendship with one of her students, Davy, who is the son of the character who gets beaten up, and she bonds with Davy. She has an emotional connection with Davy, and she tries to help her family, and she gets in trouble at school because of this. And Davy as a character was just lovely. I just love Davy, and I love that part of the story. But most of the book was just very, very slow moving. But then the last, I want to say 50 pages, it's hard for me to tell because I listened to this. Oh, which by the way, I really enjoyed the narrator. It's told in an Irish brogue that is just delicious. I absolutely love that. So I would say the last maybe hour was really, really good. Really good. Stuff happens. I couldn't listen to it enough. The last 50 pages elevated it for me. Good morning. So I am on my last day, I would say my last couple hours in London, and I finished Take My Hand while I was here. I have my book with me, but I've already packed it. I'm literally on my way to the airport right now, but I wanted to do my first vlog of my review of the Booktube Prize while I was still in London. So you've probably heard me talk ad nauseum about, I met Lena Norms, which is amazing, and the Harry Styles show was amazing, and I met Jem from Gemma Books, and Alice and the Giant Bookshelf, and I met all of the authors with the exception of Barbara Kingsolver. She was there at the Women's Prize Festival, but she couldn't sign books, so I didn't actually meet her, but I met all the other ones and spoke to all of them, in addition to meeting Alif Shafak. It was an amazing day, but you've all heard that because I'm filming this on June 15th, but you're not gonna see it until August. Anyways, I just finished Take My Hand yesterday, and well, let's just get to it. I fucking loved it. It was such a great story. It's one of those stories, it's based on true events. The author, Dolenz Perkins, terrible. I'm terrible. I wish I don't want to take it out of my suitcase. The author said in an author note that while this is based on true events, this actually happened. She fictionalized, obviously the interactions with people, the emotional response to what happened. And if you don't know, this is a story that takes place in the early 1970s about reproductive rights of poor Black women specifically, and how there were federally funded programs that allowed basically the government to sterilize young women, young girls, minors, and whether or not they were minors, always without their consent. It's talked about a young nurse who found out about it through the clinic that she was working at, and she went to a local attorney and they sued the federal government. And so that's the story here in Take My Hand. The nurse in this story, her name is Sybil Townsend, which I absolutely loved that the author named this character Sybil. Sybil's parents named her that for civil rights. Anyway, she's a young Black woman. She's a nurse. She leads a relatively affluent life. Her father is a doctor. I think her grandfather was a doctor. I'm not sure. That might be a lie. But they live in Alabama, but they live in the more affluent section of Alabama. Her mother is an artist, but her mother's suffering from some depression. And anyways, you're following Sybil as she finds her footing as a nurse herself. She gets a file, 2 patients, 2 young girls, India and her sister by 2 years older, Erica. And they live out in this shanty in the very, very poorest part of the town. And Sybil is tasked with being their nurse and giving them Depo-Provera shots, which Sybil takes issue with to begin with because these girls are 11 and 13. They're not sexually active, but it was the mentality of white folks and people in authority that if you were poor or if you were Black or if you were any kind of marginalized person, that you were sexually active, irresponsible, and the like. So she took issue with that, but she was a new nurse. She wanted to keep her job. She decided to stop giving them the shots, but marking in the file that she was giving them the shots. And then she finds out one day, on one of her days off, that one of the lead nurses takes them to the hospital and has them sterilized. And that's where the story begins. It's an incredible story of bravery. It references the true story of hundreds of Black men who were not treated for syphilis for like 40 years for the purposes of medical experiments. And it really just kind of talks about how the government was allowed to just run roughshod over the poor, over the Black. And then it also kind of talked about how even there were some things that were considered good intentions, and even how good intentions can have severe, tragic consequences. There's a lot more that happens. It talks about Sybil's relationship with her mentally ill mother. It talks about Sybil's relationship with her dad, which is a good one, but her dad wants so much more for Sybil than just being a nurse. So many people do, and Sybil just doesn't believe in herself. Sybil deals with a lot of guilt because she was the girl's nurse, and all this bad stuff happens to them, and she really attaches emotionally to this family, the two girls, their father and their grandmother, who all live together. Sybil goes and, tries to help them get government assistance, better housing, all this stuff, and she gets so attached to this family that her own life suffers. Again, I'm talking more about what happens in the book, and rather than my review of the book. It's beautifully written. I want to read her first book, Wench. Such a great story. I love a story that tells something that actually happened. I feel a little bit more educated. I'm appalled that this happens. As a matter of fact, in the author's note, she also states that there are still federally funded programs where women are sterilized without their consent, like women in prisons, women who are considered mentally incompetent to be mothers. This still happens. I just love books that shine a light on things that I normally wouldn't have a clue about. She just does it in such a beautiful way. This was an easily accessible book. I flipped through it super quickly. I connected with Sybil. I connected with all of the characters. Pardon me for the abrupt change. So there I was sitting in a beautiful little park in London, and then somebody came and sat on the park bench that I was sitting on, and I just couldn't continue doing it. I just want to finish my thoughts on Take My Hand. I really had these grand plans to do this entire video vlog style, kind of like I did my first Booktube Prize round, to just go to different places and have different things as my background, and it just didn't work out. June was incredibly busy, and I just didn't get around to doing that. So here I sit in my plain old background in my office, in my book room. I still have 2 books to read, and who knows how July will go. Maybe I will do those reviews vlog style, but the next couple of books is going to be from right here. So I do just want to finish some thoughts that I had on Take My Hand. I did want to mention that some have pointed out that there's the whole white savior aspect in this story, and I just feel like absolutely not. Does Sybil hire a white attorney to pursue her cause? Well, yes, but make no mistake, Sybil is the hero in this story. She sees a wrong and she does everything in her power to right that wrong. And the way I view that whole white savior thing, there are people out in the world who can share your views and can be warriors alongside you that don't necessarily run in your groups, don't look like you, whatever. Sybil absolutely is the hero of the story. I also want to say one of the great things about this story too is that, yes, there were a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blaming as far as what went down and who was responsible and everything, but the fingers weren't just pointing at white people. There was a lot of blame to go around here, and it was shared by a lot of different groups, but mostly it was shared by people in power, people in government. I thought that was handled beautifully in this story. Going back to the structure of the story, if I didn't mention already, this was a dual timeline from Sybil's point of view, and you're going back and forth from present day back to 1973, 74, I believe, and Sybil's kind of recounting mentally and educationally and emotionally and how all that affects her currently. This book was very well researched. The characters were very well fleshed out. They were multi-dimensional and very real. For instance, you have Mace, who were the 2 little girls' father. He's a Black man, he's uneducated, he's illiterate, yet he's knowledgeable about things. He's able to have an intelligent conversation about things. He has a curiosity, And he has massive, huge love for his daughters, and he wants justice for his daughters. There's so much more to Mace than I can actually say here, but I just want to say he just felt very, very real to me, as did all the other characters in this story. This is another great work of fiction that just goes beyond entertainment. I absolutely love this book. The next book I read was Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart. Gosh, this book, you guys. Okay, first things first, I listened to this and that was a mistake for me. This takes place in Glasgow, Scotland. The narrator is Scottish. It is narrated in a very heavy, thick Scottish accent, and I had a hard time understanding a lot of what was said at the beginning. I normally listen at 1 1/4 speed. I had to slow this down at real-time speed. And then even then, there was slang that I didn't understand that wasn't explained. Not that it should have been, but it was just very hard to understand at first. But once you get immersed in the story, it became a little bit easier for me. It also started off kind of right in the middle of things. The story opens up with Mungo going on this camping trip with these two strange men, and his mom is like waving from the window. And you're like, what is happening? Why is this happening? And then what ends up happening is that the story goes back and forth in time. You are following Mungo. He's 15 years old. He is Scottish. He's poor. His mother's an alcoholic. His older brother Hamish is a gang leader, super brutal, violent young man who has unfortunately an influence over Mungo. Mungo also has an older sister, Jody, I think is her name, who adores Mungo, sees more in him, I think the most in him than anybody else in Mungo's life. His mother, who, like I said, is an alcoholic, she is known to frequently just disappear for weeks, if not months on end. Her children have to fend for themselves. At one point, Mungo meets James, who is a young boy around his age, maybe a couple of years older, who lives in his neighborhood. And he is someone who, other than Jody, is a gentle soul in Mungo's life. And ultimately, Mungo falls in love with James. They fall in love with each other, really. So this book alternates between chapters that are covering this weird camping trip that Mungo is on with these two strangers that endorsed by Mungo's mom, and chapters that are following Mungo and his time spent with James. You gradually learn the reason why Mungo is on this camping trip, as well as everything that happens on this camping trip. And then you also are following this budding relationship between Mungo and James. You have also little scenes of Mungo's relationship with Hamish, his older brother, and Hamish's ongoing need to turn Mungo into a man in his view. He is constantly asking Mungo to join him on the activities that his gang goes on that are violent and destructive. And you learn how these things affect Mungo. Because Mungo is a gentle, gentle soul. He's very sensitive, but at the same time, he loves his family. And his brother and his sister are really, well, he loves his mom too, despite her many, many flaws. I just want to say right at this point, Mungo suffers tremendously in this story. There's neglect from his mother, there's physical abuse from his brother as well as other people, there's sexual abuse in this story. It's a tragic story. If you've read Shuggie Bain, but you haven't read this one yet, I haven't read Shuggie Bain yet. Will I? Likely. And I'll tell you in just a reason why. This book was tragically sad, but there was hope in it. The writing was gorgeous. I mean, truly gorgeous writing. I will say one thing though, Douglas Stewart does this thing, and I probably wouldn't mention it, but it happens a lot in the story, a lot. You know that thing where authors will tell instead of show? Well, Stewart both shows and tells. And I don't know if that is on purpose because he doesn't think he's showing well enough, or if he doesn't think the reader understands his showing. I don't know. Either way, it made this book longer than it really needed to be. If I remember correctly from the synopsis, I think I expected more about James and Mungo's relationship. And don't get me wrong, there is plenty there. That relationship is fleshed out, but this book is more focused on being young and being gay and being poor in 1980s Glasgow. That is truly the bulk of this story. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I think I just expected it to be less about that and more about James and Mungo's relationship. So I will say it was a very difficult book for me to get into because you're plopped into the story and you don't really realize what's going on for a while. Because on the audiobook, it was so hard for me to understand. But once I was immersed in the story, of course, I fell in love with Mungo. I wanted to know what happens. I wanted to see how this played out. I wish I had read the physical copy. And when I read Shuggie Bain, I will be reading the physical copy, because regardless of what criticisms I have, there's no denying the writing is just stellar here. I mean, it really, truly was incredibly beautiful writing. When you're writing about such tragic, sad, hopeless events, and at the same time, you're just uplifted by the prose, there's a skill there, an art form there that's just undeniable. The characters were very, very well developed and fleshed out if you can understand the slang. I feel like someone else who is a little bit more familiar with that vernacular and the slang and the accent and all of that would get even more out of this book. This book was hard-hitting, and if I were to just wrap it up in a package, I would say this is a beautiful coming-of-age story wrapped up in a suspense thriller, because there's a lot happening where I was on the edge of my seat, like, what in the F is going to happen? And when I finished this book, I was frustrated at how difficult a time I had with it, especially at the beginning and multiple times throughout the middle. Mungo has stayed with me for several weeks. It's been a few weeks since I finished Young Mungo, and he has stayed with me. I will never forget Mungo. I would have to say, after it's kind of settled in my bones a little bit, that I loved this book. I truly did. I loved Mungo. Okay, so the next book that I read was Kaikeyi by Vaishnavi Patel. Oh, you guys, this book, I'm not going to hold it up because of the glare. This book, you guys, was such a struggle for me. I had to check it out from the library 3 times. I struggled. It took me almost a month to read it. Now, in its defense, it was the month of June, mostly. As you know, if you've watched before, June was extremely busy with the trip to London and the trip to Tampa and all of that. But still, I had a hard time getting through this book. So if you don't know, this is a retelling of Ramayana, which is an epic poem from ancient India. So think Beowulf, but from India. And it's about the life of Rama, who was a legendary prince, and Kaikeyi was his evil stepmother. And this story is a retelling from her perspective, and she is not portrayed as evil. So you're following Kaikeyi's life from the time she's a child, growing up with her 7 or 8 brothers. Her father is the ruler of her kingdom. One of her brothers is her twin, and they are super, super close. Her mother has been exiled from the kingdom for mysterious reasons, and her father seemingly dislikes Kaikeyi just for being a girl. So as she's growing up, her twin brother teaches her how to fight, how to ride, and do all these things that serve her when she is an adult. She also goes kind of exploring one day in her palace and goes down into the cellar, finds all these scrolls, and she discovers that she has a certain magic. It's called the binding plane. And with this binding plane, she learns kind of how to read other people and how those people view her. And she kind of can encourage people to see things her way. As she grows older, she learns how to kind of fine-tune that ability, and that plays into the story later. So then Kaikeyi grows up. She gets married, and the man she marries, she ends up having a really, really close relationship over the years. They're very, very good friends. But Kaikeyi is the third wife in this relationship, and the two wives are still around. And the reason Kaikeyi is brought into this relationship is because the first two wives have been unable to produce an heir. So Kaikeyi agrees to be his third wife under the condition that her son that she will produce becomes the ruler. The guy agrees. Years pass. There's some stuff going on, and all three women have sons. And it turns out that Kaikeyi and the other two wives, they form a really, really close relationship. They're friends. They do things for each other. It's all sincere. It's wonderful. Yay. They also form a council so that they help the women in their kingdom. And then it comes down to the time when the son of the first wife, who is Rama, it's time for him to get ready to inherit the throne. And that's when Kaikeyi says, whoa, slow your roll. You made a promise. And her husband brings up an argument to say, I know I promised you that, but here are the reasons why Rama should be king. And actually, in the story, Kaikeyi agrees and they work it out. But then her twin brother, who is now the ruler of her childhood kingdom, comes to town and says, oh, no, the promise wasn't made to you, Kaikeyi. The promise was made to our father and our kingdom, and your son needs to be the ruler. And if that doesn't happen, we're all going to war. Now, I put it all like that, and it sounds like a really good story, right? And I guess it was, but it started off super slow. I didn't care because this is, for me, I was more engaged in stories like Song of Achilles and Stone Blind because Greek mythology I'm more familiar with. I'm not familiar with ancient Indian mythology or the gods and goddesses of Hinduism and all that. I'm just not familiar with it. So I just couldn't relate. I couldn't connect to Kaikeyi. It just was very slow going. I have to say that if I wasn't reading it for the Booktube Prize, I probably would have DNF'd. However, now that I'm finished with the story, I am glad that I read it. You know, I'm always glad to learn something new. So there's that. But this was longer than it needed to be. God, I sound like a broken record when I say that, right? It just was very, very slow going. I would say the first third of the book was excruciating. But the last third of the book I found very engaging. I wanted to know what happened. And the whole storyline with Kaikeyi wanting to be kind of a champion for women of the age, while I appreciate that, I felt like it didn't really add to this story. I felt like it should have kept with the promise that was made to her by her husband about who was going to inherit the throne and the politics of how this works between the two kingdoms. I found that all very, very fascinating. So ultimately, yes, it was a good story at its core. I think she did a really, really good job with the writing because as I'm thinking back on the story, I have actual visualization of Kaikeyi, of the things that she wore, of the palace that she lived in her chambers, the other wives, her sons. I can see that in my mind's eye, and that I attribute solely to Patel's writing. So I can't help but just praise that part of this experience. But I was just frustrated at how long it took me to finish this book. You know, it's 475 pages. I don't think it needed to be that long, but I will just point out that is a me thing. If you like a good mythical retelling saga style story, then I would recommend this. But other than that, it wasn't my favorite. I didn't hate it, but it wasn't my favorite. Hi guys, so here's another fail of my vlogging, my reviews of the Booktube Prize books that I'm reading. So I am bringing you to the exotic location of my bedroom. I just finished Horse last night, and so I wanted to talk about it while it was still fresh. I'm here to talk to you about Horse by Geraldine Brooks. This is a library copy. It's going to go back today. This one had the potential to enter into the love category, but I think it's more at a like category. I did like this book, and I am going to tell you the things that I did like about it, but there were definitely some things that I didn't like about it as well. And I know I'm not alone in this. And it took me by such surprise. It's crazy. Anyways, let me back up and tell you what this is about. So horse in the title is specifically talking about an actual horse that existed called Lexington. He was the sire horse of the most winningest horses in the history of horse racing. I don't know if that's actually changed since like Secretariat or some other horses that have come since him, but for decades in the horse racing industry, Lexington sired more horses that won more races than any other horse at the time. And this not only follows the horse, but the people around Lexington that made it possible for him to be as successful as he was. So this is historical fiction. There are 3 timelines. The first timeline starts around the birth of Lexington around 1850-ish. Then there's a timeline in the 1950s, and then there's a present day timeline that is around 2019. Back in the 1850s, you have the owner of the horse, but you mainly are following Jarrett, who is a young boy who is a slave, and his father is a groom for all the thoroughbreds on this particular ranch owned by the man who also owns Jarrett. So Jarrett grows up around horses, and he has a particularly close bond with Lexington from the time he's born. And he is with him throughout his whole life, his training, his racing career, and all the things that happen in between. It is a lovely story. It's harrowing and heartbreaking and heartwarming and hopeful, and there's so much going on in that storyline. I really, really loved the storyline of Jarrett and Lexington. Then the present day story follows Jess, who is a scientist who is tasked with kind of putting together correctly the bones of a horse that end up being Lexington. And Jess meets another scientist who is interested in studying those bones to kind of find out what story they would tell as far as the endurance and speed of a horse and ultimately the success of that horse. And then Jess also meets Theo, who is a PhD student who meets Jess after he discovers a painting discarded at a curb across the street from his apartment. And he wants to find kind of the meaning behind it, maybe its value. And it is a painting of what turns out to be Lexington. So there are these connections. Oh, and then the third storyline that kind of takes place in between these two storylines in the 1950s is a woman. She is a gallery owner, and she comes across a painting of Lexington, a different painting, and it turns out her family history is connected to the horse in the painting. And so you're going back and forth among these 3 storylines. Number 1, I found the 1950 storyline unnecessary. The things that happened in it, first of all, it was very, very small part of the story. It almost seemed like an add-in. She wanted to kind of bridge the 1850 storyline to the present day storyline. I didn't think it was necessary. As I said before, I loved Jarrett's storyline. This is not only a story about horse racing and this particular horse and its success. This is also a story about race. This is a story about how there were so many Black jockeys, grooms, trainers, handlers, the backbone of the horse racing industry at its very beginning, and really helped build it to what it was. And it made many white people very, very rich, and they are kind of the unsung heroes of that industry. Now, let me back up and just say, when I say that, I am not a fan of horse racing. I don't think it should be legal. I think, especially in today's society, the way they treat horses as they're trained, the food that they're given, and the chemicals that they are given to make their bones more brittle and light, to make them faster. I am just completely opposed to the sport as it is. So just let me just throw that out there here. But just to talk about this story, that there were a lot of good people who did a lot of very good work, skilled workers, and they just didn't get the credit for it. And the research that went into this book, I am super impressed by. Now, let me just tell you, there's a thing that happens in the present day storyline, and I'm going to have to spoil it in order to share with you. So, like happens in the last 50 pages, made me insane. If you don't want to be spoiled, I'm going to put a banner here, and when that banner goes away, then you can keep watching. The thing that happens to Theo towards the end of the book, I thought was completely unnecessary. I thought it was just a way for Brooks to put her 2 cents in as far as this political narrative, to kind of say, yes, I'm with you, I stand with you when it comes to police brutality and the racism that is involved in law enforcement. And I say, okay, that's great that you have those views, but just to throw it in there, I thought it was cheaply done. I thought it was unnecessary to the story. I thought she had already done such a great job to show the history of the racism in this particular corner of the world, in the sports world. She didn't have to ruin it, which I think she kind of did by throwing this incident that happened to Theo. How that whole thing played out, I thought it was abrupt way to end the story. I liked how there was a present day storyline as far as these paintings that were done in Jarrett's lifetime, with Jarrett in the paintings, and there's kind of that bridge between the 2 timelines. I liked that a lot, but I think there could have been a better way to wrap up the present day storyline. I don't know what it is, but I think it could have been better. I absolutely loved Jarrett's story, and I loved that she told this story, and I loved the background as far as like the true history of it. I thought that was all very well done. And like I said, the research that went into this is commendable. This had potential to be an absolutely love for me. And unfortunately, with the unnecessary things that I've mentioned already padding this book, it wasn't a love. I liked it, and I'm glad I read it. And this is a perfect example of why I don't do star ratings anymore, because there were certain parts of the book that were 4 and 5 stars, and then there was the 2-star incident. You know what I mean? I would recommend it for sure. It's well written. It's an incredible dive and exploration into a very sordid part of our history. And that's the other thing I'll mention too that I actually really liked about this story. It was multifaceted as far as it wasn't just white people, bad guys, black people victimized. No, she's shown a light on the fact that there were white folks who actually were very supportive of the anti-slavery movement. And then it also talked about a character, a very small character, but important one, of a black man who was also a slaveholder. So, and who also got very, very rich on the horse racing industry and the business of slavery. I like how she explored both sides of the coin. Yeah, lots of feelings about this book. I also will mention one last thing before I finish up here, and that is, interestingly enough, right when I was about to open and read this book, a nonfiction book came out like the same day I started to read this book, and that it's called Lexington. Full title is Lexington: The Extraordinary Life and Turbulent Times of America's Legendary Racehorse. It's by Kim Wickens. If you've read this and you were really interested to learn more about the horse, then I would recommend that nonfiction book, or just read them both as companion books. Who knows? But yes, I would recommend this, but it had some problems for me, and I can tell you right now, this will not be ranked number 1. Those are my thoughts about Horse by Geraldine Brooks. Hi guys. So hopefully you'll be able to hear me because I'm out and about. I'm in the little square that is right in front of the bookstore I work at, and so I just wanted to show you. There it is, E. Shaver Booksellers. So I just wanted to film my last review for the books that I'm reading for the Booktube Prize, and the last one is Trust by Hernan Diaz. So this one started off really good for me, and then it kind of went downhill. I had mentioned before that when I first heard buzz about this book, I was excited about it. It sounded kind of interesting, and then I kind of read a little bit more about what it was about and how there were 4 narratives, and I knew based on that I wasn't going to listen to it, but it also had me just concerned whether I was going to read it at all. And then of course I got assigned it for the Booktube Prize, and I was a little hesitant, but you know, it won the Pulitzer. Of course, it shares it with Demon Copperhead, and lots of people really love it. If you don't know, it's 4 separate narratives that are connected to each other, and it explains in the table of contents what each narrative is, so you know kind of what's going on, but there are certain things that you kind of figure out as you read along. The first part is basically a novel within a novel. It is a novel called Bonds by, I can't remember the author's name. You read that part and it is about the Rasks, Benjamin and Helen Rask, I believe. And it takes place in the 1920s. How they are the top of the socialite game and they're rich in the finance business. And the richer and more successful the husband gets, the more the wife kind of mentally deteriorates. Then the second part is from the point of view of Andrew Bevel. He is writing a memoir, so it's like partially written. As you're reading his memoir, you see notes that are in there, just kind of stuck in there. Write more about XYZ or add more detail about this. Then the third part is from the point of view of a woman, Ida Partenza, who is hired by Andrew Bevel to rewrite Bevel's memoir. And he is basically attacking the first book that's in the first part. And then the fourth part, I won't tell you what that is, but it is another point of view basically on the same story. I would say the first 2/3 of the book I was really enjoying. I was getting through pretty quickly. And then the last third of the book just lost the thread for me. I was bored. I didn't care. This book is about the finance world, specifically in the 1920s, how America economically soared and lots of people got rich. Industrialism and manufacturing and just in the world of finance, and then of course the crash of 1929 and why that happened, and capitalism and consumerism and all of that. And that's interesting to a point, but there's just too much of it in here for me, for my taste in this book. It is very, very well written. And the story, I guess, is even objectively an interesting one, but it wasn't one that I would gravitate towards, one that I would connect. Of all the characters, I really didn't connect with any of them. So this wasn't my favorite. I'm glad I read it. Would I read something else by this author? If all of his books are written with this kind of ambition, I don't know, it might be just a little bit above my pay grade. Do I recommend this one? I mean, I think there's a lot of you out there who would enjoy this, who would find yourself immersed in that whole era. Like, I love historical fiction, so I liked learning a lot about that era. I don't read a whole lot about the 20s and 30s and the crash. And I think if it was a little bit more varied as far as all that was going on in the time and not just so focused on the world of finance and Wall Street, I think I probably would have enjoyed it a little bit more. They do explore kind of mental health issues and the lack of resources for people who suffer from mental health issues at the time. And I appreciated that. But overall, it was just not a book that I gravitate towards. So I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it. And I am glad I read it. So there you have it. Those are my thoughts on all of the books that I read for the Booktube Prize. You'll notice that there were a lot of I liked it, but I didn't love it for some of these books. That was I think the trend for my thoughts on these books. Before I tell you my rankings of the books for the semifinals, I will let you know what the results are for the finals for the Booktube Prize. If you haven't watched that video, I will link the Booktube Prize channel as well as the finalist results down in the description below. But if you haven't watched that video yet, the finalists are Trust by Hernan Diaz, Foster by Claire Keegan, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu, Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart, and Trespasses by Louise Kennedy. I am pleased for the most part. I have read all of these books and I enjoyed most of them. The exception I would say is How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. I didn't dislike it, but it wasn't for me. I'm not here to talk about those books. Here are my rankings for the books that I read for the semifinals for the Booktube Prize. In 6th place, as it'll probably come as no surprise to you, is Kaikeyi. I would say out of these 6 books, I struggled with 2 of them, and Kaikeyi I just struggled the most with. It took, like I said, a month to read it. It wasn't a story that I would normally gravitate towards. And like I said in my video, I probably would have DNF'd it had I not been reading it for the Booktube Prize. So that's why it's in 6th place. In 5th place is the other book that I struggle with, and that is Trust. Again, it just wasn't a topic that I gravitate towards. I like historical fiction, but all of the finance and the high society and the wealth and capitalism and all that, that just isn't for me. And while it started off very promising, it just ended up going downhill and I lost interest towards the end. Coming in at 4th place, and I would have to say 3rd and 4th place was a struggle for me between the 2 books that were in these places, which was going to be in 3rd, which was going to be in 4th. So I chose for 4th place Trespasses. While it has stayed with me, it wasn't what I had hoped it would be, and I wasn't as engaged in it as I was in the book that I picked to be in 3rd place. So for 3rd place, I put Horse. And while I talked about the thing that really, really ticked me off about the book, for the most part, I was super engaged and enjoyed the story. I loved the connection between the timeline that took place in the past and the timeline that's in the present. And I was just more fully engaged. I didn't know what to expect for that book. And so I didn't have any preconceived expectations. So I think it had that going for it. So that's why it just barely nudged Trespasses out of 3rd place. And coming in at number 2, I picked Young Mungo. Even though I had such a hard time getting into the book for the reasons that I stated, he's just still with me. I loved the story. I loved the writing. It was a beautiful story, and that's why it ended up at number 2. And of course, my number 1 pick for this round was Take My Hand. Absolutely love that story. You know, it was the first book that I read out of the 6, and it set this bar super high, and that's just what happened. I love that story. I can't wait to see what she comes out with next. I am absolutely gutted that it did not make it into the finals. And I feel, nothing against Trust. I don't want to bash any books, but I feel like Trust, being that it won the Pulitzer Prize with Demon Copperhead, I almost feel like it made it into the finals, people picking it without reading it. I don't mean to trash it like that. That's just how I feel. For that to make it to the finals and not Take My Hand, I have feelings about that. But all in all, I had a really good time judging the Booktube Prize. I probably will do it again next year. I just think I'll plan it a little better next year. So anyways, I will be back to my regularly scheduled reading program. So you'll be getting more books from me from my wrap-ups, thankfully. Thank you so much for your patience, and I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Have you read any of these books? What do you think about the finalists for the Booktube Prize? Do you agree with the finalists? I would love to hear about it, or you can just say hi down in the doodly-doo. If you're still watching at this point, please consider giving that like button a boop, and a subscribe would be wonderful. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.